the War of 1812, which had highlighted the United States' lack of strong coastal defenses. Named for Revolutionary War general and South Carolina native Thomas Sumter, Fort Sumter was one of nearly 50 forts built as part of the so-called Third System, which was a coastal defense program implemented by Congress in 1817. The three-tiered, five-sided fort's coastal placement was designed to allow it to control access to the vital Charleston harbor. While the island itself was only 2.4 acres in size, the fort was built to accommodate a garrison of 650 soldiers and 135 artillery pieces. Construction of Fort Sumter first began in 1829 in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, on a man-made island built from thousands of tons of granite. Building ground to a halt in the 1830s amid a dispute over ownership of the stretch of the harbor and did not resume until 1841. Like many Third System fortifications, Fort Sumter proved a costly endeavor, and construction slowed again in 1859 due to lack of funding. By 1860, the island and the outer fortifications were complete, but the fort's interior and arraignments remained unfinished. So for the Battle of Fort Sumter, the first battle, construction of Fort Sumter was still underway when South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Despite Charleston's position as a major port at the time, only 2 companies of federal troops guarded the harbor. Commanded by Major Robert Anderson, these companies were stationed at Fort Moultrie, a dilapidated fortification facing the coastline. Recognizing that Fort Moultrie was vulnerable to a land assault, Anderson elected to abandon it for the more easily defensible Fort Sumter on December 26, 1860. South Carolina militia forces would seize the city's other forts shortly thereafter, leaving Fort Sumter as the lone federal outpost in Charleston. A standoff ensued until January 9, 1861, when a ship called the Star of the West arrived in Charleston with over 200 U.S. troops and supplies intended for Fort Sumter. South Carolina militia batteries fired upon the vessel as it neared Charleston Harbor, forcing it to turn back to sea. Major Anderson refused repeated calls to abandon Fort Sumter, and by March 1861, there were over 3,000 militia troops besieging his garrison. A number of other U.S. military facilities in the Deep South had already been seized, and Fort Sumter was viewed by many as one of the South's few remaining hurdles to overcome before achieving sovereignty. With the inauguration of President Abraham Lincoln in March 1861, the situation soon escalated. Knowing that Anderson and his men were running out of supplies, Lincoln announced his intention to send 3 unarmed ships to relieve Fort Sumter. Having already declared that any attempt to resupply the fort would be seen as an act of aggression, South Carolina militia forces soon scrambled to respond. On April 11th, militia commander P.G.T. Beauregard demanded that Anderson surrender the fort, but Anderson again refused. In response, Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter shortly after 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. U.S. Captain Abner Doubleday, later famous for the myth that he invented baseball, ordered the first shots in defense on the fort a few hours later. Beauregard's 19 coastal batteries unleashed a punishing barrage on Fort Sumter, eventually firing an estimated 3,000 shots on the citadel in 34 hours. By Saturday, April 13th, cannon fire had broken through the fortress's 5-foot thick brick walls, causing fires inside the post. With his stores of ammunition depleted, Anderson was forced to surrender the fort shortly after 2 p.m. in the afternoon. No Union troops had been killed during the bombardment, but 2 men died the following day in an explosion that occurred during an artillery salute held before the U.S. evacuation. The bombardment of Fort Sumter would play a major part in triggering the Civil War. In the days following the assault, Lincoln issued a call for Union volunteers to squash the rebellion, while more southern states, including Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, cast their lot with the Confederacy. So we're running short on time, guys, but I do want to recap a little bit of what we've learned just with our PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to cut the lights, and I'm only going to run through part of it, and we'll finish the rest tomorrow. So having to do with slavery, the Underground Railroad was an escape route by the slaves in order to try to leave the South. Harriet Tubman was one of the conductors, the main conductor for the Underground Railroad. She helped over 300 slaves to freedom. If anybody's read Uncle Tom's Cabin, this was the book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which described the evils of slavery, and it painted Southerners in a very negative light. Nat Turner was a slave preacher, and he believed God was calling him to start an uprising. And Abraham Lincoln, again, he was the 16th president. The Lincoln-Douglas debates put him on the map, and his main goal was to preserve the Union. He didn't believe that blacks and whites were equal, and he became the leader of the Republican Party. After Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860 without winning a single electoral vote from a southern state, again, without a single one, Southerners felt that the government no longer represented them. First, South Carolina, then 10 other states withdrew from the Union. And part of our North versus South, the North had twice the population, twice the industry, twice the railroads, and an existing Army and Navy. The South had better military leadership and could fight a defensive war. And we talked about Fort Sumter, and we talked about the casualties of war, how more died from disease than direct combat. There was little understanding of hygiene, which led to many wounds getting infected and eventually death, and amputations were very common. And you can only imagine how gross and unclean the amputations themselves were. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States of America, and the vice president was Alexander Stephens from Georgia. Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Army of Virginia, as we've talked about, and Stonewall Jackson, that was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, and he was gifted tactical commander. And he was accidentally killed. That'd be something if you were remembered by being accidentally killed. Ulysses S. Grant was the leader of the Union Army, and he forced the South surrender. He used the Anaconda Plan to strangle the South, known as the Unconditional Surrender Grant. The Battle of Gettysburg was the deadliest battle in American history, and during this 3-day battle, Lee lost 1/3 of his army and was forced to retreat back to the South. This was actually the turning point. Alright guys, I think this is a good place to stop. I want you guys to continue to work on your assignments. We will be, for those of you who want to present, it's not mandatory, but for those of you who want to present, can present to the class. If not, just continue to work on them, and we will pick this up tomorrow. So thank you guys, and have a good evening tonight, and I will see you first thing in the morning.